Order. The court is now in session.
Thank you for your attention. The reforms we propose today are vital for our future. I urge bipartisan support. And I must stress this point above all others. We cannot afford to delay action any longer. The time for change is now. The evidence before us is clear. We must act now to address these issues. We must act now with unity and resolve. The challenges ahead demand our full commitment. Together, we will forge a better path.
I can't believe this is happening. Please, you have to understand. I'm begging you.
He walked into that courtroom laughing. A teenager who had taken a human life was standing before a judge, grinning like he had already won, because in his mind he had. But what happened in the next few minutes would become one of the most chilling courtroom moments ever captured on camera. The kind of moment that reminds you that some people do not feel what you and I feel. And when the judge finally spoke, that laughter disappeared so fast it was almost like it had never existed at all. This is the story of Ethan Ray Hollis, and this is the story of the moment his entire world collapsed in front of everyone watching. Calloway County, Kentucky. A Thursday morning in late November. The kind of cold that seeps through the walls and settles into the bones before you even step outside. The courthouse on Maple Street had seen hundreds of defendants walk through its doors over the decades. Petty theft, drug possession, drunk driving, the ordinary wreckage of ordinary lives. But on this particular morning, the case on the docket was anything but ordinary. Ethan Ray Hollis, 18 years old, had been charged with first-degree murder in the death of 22-year-old Connor Baines, a young man who had just started his first real job at a logistics warehouse on the edge of town. Connor had been found in the parking lot of a gas station off Route 68 in the early hours of a September morning, stabbed 4 times. His phone shattered on the asphalt beside him. He had managed to call 911 before losing consciousness, but by the time paramedics arrived, there was nothing left to save. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation had taken 3 months. Detectives had been careful, methodical, building a case layer by layer until there was almost nothing left to argue against. Surveillance footage, cell phone records, a bloody jacket found stuffed behind the water heater in the Hollis family basement, a text message sent from Ethan's phone to an unknown number 45 minutes before the attack that read simply, "It's done." Ethan Hollis had been arrested at school on a Wednesday afternoon, walked out of his chemistry class in handcuffs, while his classmates stared. He had not said a word during the arrest. He had not cried. He had not asked for his mother. He had simply looked at the arresting officers with an expression so flat and empty that one of them would later describe it in a deposition as like looking at a wall. But that flatness did not last. By the time Ethan arrived at the courthouse on the morning of his sentencing hearing, something had shifted in him. He had spent months in pretrial detention, had sat through the full length of a 3-week trial, had watched the jury deliberate for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. And yet, standing in the holding room just outside the courtroom with his court-appointed attorney, he was smiling. Not the polite, restrained smile of someone trying to appear composed. A genuine, open, wide smile. The kind of smile you would wear on the last day of school or the morning of your birthday. His attorney, a man named Douglas Fairweather, who had spent 26 years doing criminal defense work and had developed a face capable of remaining perfectly neutral under almost any circumstance, looked at his client with something that bordered on disbelief. "Ethan," he said quietly, adjusting his tie, "I need you to understand what today is." Ethan glanced at him sideways. "I know what today is." "Then you understand the range of outcomes we are looking at." "I understand," Ethan said, and the smile did not move. Fairweather studied him for a long moment. In 26 years, he had seen defendants cry, rage, beg, pray, vomit, pass out, and in one memorable case, attempt to flee through a courtroom window. But what he was looking at right now was different. It was something quieter and more unsettling than any of those. For Ethan Hollis genuinely did not seem to believe that anything bad was about to happen to him. "Let me ask you something," Fairweather said, keeping his voice low. "What do you think is going to happen today?" Ethan leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms. "I think she is going to give me the minimum, maybe less. I think she is going to look at my age, look at my record, and decide that locking me away forever does not serve anyone. There is case law. There is precedent. I read everything you sent me." Fairweather was quiet for a moment. "Ethan, you were convicted of first-degree murder. The jury found premeditation. The prosecution has been asking for life without the possibility of parole." "Prosecutors always ask for the maximum," Ethan said simply. "That does not mean they get it." The bailiff knocked on the door. "Time to go in." The courtroom was full. Connor Baines's family occupied the front 2 rows of the gallery on the right side of the room. His mother, Patricia, a small woman in her late 40s, with dark circles beneath her eyes that looked permanent, sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the defense table. Connor's older brother, Michael, sat beside her, with his jaw locked and his arms crossed, dressed in a dark suit worn only this once. Connor's father had not come. He had been unable to make himself return to this room after sitting through 3 weeks of testimony about how his youngest son had died. On the left side of the gallery, a scattering of spectators, local reporters, a few students from the high school who had known Ethan or Connor or both. A woman in a gray cardigan sat alone in the back row taking careful notes in a small spiral notebook. Ethan entered from the side door in a gray detention uniform, his hands cuffed in front of him, escorted by 2 corrections officers. The moment he cleared the doorway, he scanned the room like someone entering a party, his eyes moving quickly from face to face. When his gaze passed over Connor's mother, he did not slow down. He found his seat at the defense table and sat down with the easy, unhurried movement of someone who had nowhere better to be. And then he laughed. It was not a loud laugh. It was more like a sound you make when something privately amuses you, a short exhale through the nose, the corners of the mouth pulling up, the shoulders lifting slightly. He had spotted someone in the gallery, one of his former classmates who had apparently come to watch, and he gave that person a small nod and laughed quietly, as if they were sharing a joke. Patricia Baines, Connor's mother, flinched. The sound was small, but the room was quiet, and she heard it, and she flinched as if something had struck her. Michael Baines turned to look at Ethan with an expression that the reporter from the local paper would later struggle to describe accurately. It was not anger exactly. It was something older and more exhausted than anger. Douglas Fairweather, seated beside his client, did not look at Ethan. He looked at the judge's bench because that was the only place worth looking right now. Judge Meredith Alcorn entered from the door behind the bench, and the bailiff called the court to order. She was a woman in her early 60s, white-haired, compact, with reading glasses hanging from a lanyard around her neck. She had been a judge in Calloway County for 17 years. In that time, she had sentenced people to death and to decades in prison and to years that their families called mercy. She had developed an almost preternatural ability to read a room within the first 30 seconds of walking into it. She walked to her bench, set down her folder, and looked at the defense table. She looked at Ethan Hollis. He was still smiling. Judge Alcorn sat down, put on her reading glasses, and opened the folder in front of her. She did not say anything for a long moment. The room was so quiet that the sound of her turning a single page was audible from the back row. "Before we proceed to sentencing," she said without looking up, "I will hear victim impact statements. Mrs. Patricia Baines." Patricia stood slowly. Her son Michael reached out and put a hand briefly on her arm before she walked to the podium. She placed a photograph of Connor on the wooden surface in front of her, a picture taken at a cookout the previous summer. He was laughing at something off camera, wearing a blue shirt, his hair slightly too long. He looked like someone who had a lot of years ahead of him. Patricia spoke for 9 minutes. She talked about the morning she had to identify her son's body. She talked about the first week afterward, when she had kept waking up at night convinced she had heard him come home. She talked about his voice, the way he would say her name when he called. Never Mom, always Mama, even at 22 years old. She talked about packing up his apartment alone over 3 days in October, carrying his boxes down the stairs and loading them into the back of her car, and how that was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. She did not look at Ethan while she spoke. She had made that decision before entering the room, and she kept it for every one of those 9 minutes. Ethan watched her speak. The smile was gone during this statement, but his expression was not grief, and it was not guilt. It was something closer to careful attention, the look of someone listening to a presentation in a language they do not fully understand. When Patricia returned to her seat, Michael Baines stood and walked to the podium without being called. He placed both hands flat on the surface and looked directly at Ethan. "I'm not going to talk about my brother," he said. "You do not deserve to hear me talk about my brother. What I want to say is this. I watched you during this trial. I watched you today when you walked in here. You think you are going to walk out of this room and go somewhere and eventually come back. You think this is temporary. I want you to understand that it is not temporary. Whatever happens to you today is the rest of your life. You took the rest of Connor's life, and now you do not get one either. I hope you spend every day of whatever they give you understanding that." He stepped back from the podium and walked back to his seat without looking away from Ethan until the very last moment. There was a long silence. Judge Alcorn removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench in front of her. "Mr. Hollis," she said, "you have an opportunity to address this court before I impose sentence. Do you wish to do so?" Douglas Fairweather leaned toward his client and said something quietly. Ethan nodded and stood. He had prepared something. He had written it out by hand in his cell over the previous week, a statement about remorse and rehabilitation. He had it memorized. He opened his mouth to begin, and then Judge Alcorn leaned forward. "Before you speak," she said, "I want to make sure you understand the range of sentence I am considering, so that your statement can be made with full knowledge of what this proceeding may conclude with. The prosecution has requested life without the possibility of parole. The pre-sentence investigation report has been reviewed. I have reviewed the evidence in full. I have reviewed the manner in which this crime was carried out, the premeditation demonstrated by the evidence, on the text message evidence, the planning involved, the nature of the attack itself. I have reviewed your history and your psychological evaluations. Mr. Hollis, the minimum sentence under the statute for first-degree murder in this jurisdiction is 25 years. I want you to understand that I am not approaching this hearing with the minimum in mind." The room was completely still. Ethan blinked. The smile was gone. It had been fading since the victim impact statements, but now it was simply gone, replaced by something that might have been the first genuine emotion he had shown in this entire proceeding. His eyes moved to Fairweather, who was looking straight ahead. "You may speak," Judge Alcorn said. Ethan stood there for a moment. Whatever he had prepared, whatever carefully constructed version of remorse he had planned to deliver, seemed to have become inaccessible to him. He looked at the judge. He looked at the folder on her bench. He looked at the room. He began and stopped. "Take your time," Judge Alcorn said in a tone that contained no warmth at all. "I am sorry," Ethan said finally. The words came out flat and without much behind them, but they came out. Judge Alcorn looked at him steadily. "Thank you, Mr. Hollis. Please be seated." She opened her folder again. She put her glasses back on. She turned 2 pages. "Ethan Ray Hollis," she began. "I have presided over this court for 17 years. In that time, I have sentenced young people your age and younger, for serious crimes. In most of those cases, I have seen something, some indication of understanding, some awareness of what has been lost. What I observed during this trial and what I observed when you walked into this courtroom this morning does not reflect that kind of awareness." Ethan sat very still. "You were found guilty by a jury of your peers on all counts, including premeditated first-degree murder. The evidence presented at trial established clearly that this was not a crime of passion, not an accident, not a moment of impulse. You planned this attack. You carried it out. And for 3 months before your arrest, and for the duration of this trial, you conducted yourself in a manner that demonstrated no genuine understanding of what you had done." She paused. Connor Baines was 22 years old. He had a family who loved him. He had a life ahead of him. You decided, for reasons the evidence does not fully illuminate, that his life was less important than whatever motivated you to end it. The jury agreed with the prosecution's account of what happened and why. I have no reason to disagree with that finding. Ethan's hands folded on the table in front of him, tightened slightly. "The purpose of this sentence is not revenge, though I am aware that the family of Connor Baines has every right to whatever feelings they carry out of this room today. The purpose is to reflect the severity of what was done, to hold you accountable in a manner proportionate to the crime, and to protect the public from further harm. Based on everything before me, including your psychological evaluation, which raised significant concerns about your capacity for empathy and your understanding of consequence, I am not persuaded that a minimum sentence serves any of those purposes." The room was silent enough. that you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Ethan Ray Hollis, it is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sound that came from the defense table was small. Not a sob, not a shout, just a sharp inhalation of breath, the sound of someone who has been expecting a door to open and has instead walked into a wall. Ethan's head dropped forward. Douglas Fairweather placed a hand briefly on his client's shoulder, a professional gesture more than a human one, and then removed it. In the gallery, Patricia Baines pressed her hand over her mouth. Michael sat beside her with his eyes closed and his head bowed, not in grief, but in something that looked like the physical release of an enormous held weight. The woman in the gray cardigan in the back row stopped writing in her notebook and simply sat. Judge Alcorn struck her gavel once. The sound rang through the room and settled. This court is adjourned. The corrections officers moved to either side of Ethan and raised him from his chair. He did not resist. He did not say anything. He walked toward the side door, and for a moment, just before he passed through it, he turned and looked back at the room. Not at the gallery, not at the judge's bench, not at the prosecution table, at nothing in particular. The expression on his face was one that the reporter from the local paper would later write about at some length, trying and mostly failing to find the right words for it. The closest she could get was this. It was the look of someone who had finally understood something they should have understood a long time ago, and who was just now beginning to grasp how much that delay had cost them. The door closed behind him. The room exhaled. Outside the courthouse, Connor Baines's mother stood on the stone steps in the cold November air and did not speak to the reporters who had gathered. She stood for a moment with her face turned up toward the gray sky, breathing slowly, and then she walked down the steps toward the parking lot with Michael beside her. Somewhere inside the building, a door locked, and somewhere in the accounting of all the things that cannot be undone, a young man who had laughed on a Thursday morning in a courthouse in Kentucky began to understand what the rest of his life was going to look like. There are moments in a courtroom when the entire weight of a decision lands in absolute silence. When Ethan Ray Hollis walked through that side door for the last time, there were no cameras outside waiting for him, no crowd calling his name, nothing left of the confidence that had carried him into that room just hours before. What remained was the truth that he had spent months refusing to look at directly. Some choices cannot be walked back. Some doors, once they close, do not open again. Connor Baines's mother walked out into the cold morning air and breathed. That was enough. If this story hit you the way it hit me when I first read about it, I need you to do one thing right now. Hit that like button, because it tells the algorithm that stories like this one deserve to be seen. And if you want to keep watching cases where the truth finally wins in the end, subscribe, because we cover exactly these kinds of stories every single week. You are already here. Stay.